days, I'm not going to lie to you, there are days when I wonder whether everyone else is sane and I'm the one that's gone mad. Do you get that? Do you get that? I say, you sort of think, oh God, change the record, will you? And then there are days, of course, when you are reminded by events that, of course, you have been doing your best to stay on the straight and narrow for the longest time, while other people have been going off on all manner of unbelievable tangents, which actually is pertinent to the question I just asked you about the Kremlin ally in British politics. But sometimes they do your job for you. Sometimes I think the right-wing media really do prove the point that we have together been exploring now for the best part of a decade. There are now dozens. And, dozens is a broad church, isn't it? Dozens could be in the low hundreds, but is more likely to be just in the high dozens. There are now dozens of associates, friends and family members of Tory MPs and Tory officials being investigated by the Gambling Commission over claims that they bet on the date of the general election before it was announced. Now, I'm going to play you that clip of Chris Heaton-Harris, again speaking to Nick Ferrari this morning, in a moment with a little parallel to sport and bets placed by professional sportsmen. But before I do that, I don't think it matters, does it, whether or not they had prior knowledge. If you are a senior Tory or junior Tory or even a middling Tory or married to a Tory or working for the Tories, you don't place bets on matters political. It seems to me to be a fairly straightforward matter. But the point I'm making about right-wing media is that I know Keir Starmer is the party leader and Angela Rayner is the deputy. So they have a prominence that you couldn't apply to this sort of catalogue of incompetents who are being the ones whose names we know. It's not quite the same, is it? But the amount of coverage that you got in the Mail and the Telegraph and, of course, their fellow travellers in the broadcast media over things that everybody paying attention knew were almost certainly innocuous. The confidence, for example, with which Keir Starmer talked about his curry in Durham belied the fact that he used to be the director of public prosecutions. But some sort of excitable client journalists in cahoots with Conservative MPs managed to propel that pyramid of piffle to such prominence that the police felt compelled to investigate. And in many ways, the same thing happened with Angela Rayner. If you counted the newsprint dedicated to an innocuous curry and 15-year-old housing arrangements by two Labour politicians and compared it to the amount of coverage currently being received by individuals, many of whom as yet unidentified, who appear to have broken a moral code in a way that, well, I mean, the best way I can think of describing it is that it's reminiscent of Boris Johnson's premiership. And yet, we find ourselves this morning having to rely largely on The Guardian and the I newspaper for a sense of its importance, for a sense of its prominence. So, and fair play to Nick for hitting Chris Heaton-Harris over the head with it earlier today. Let's take a moment to reflect upon Chris Heaton-Harris, currently Secretary of State for Northern Ireland. One of those politicians whose prominence relies entirely upon his support for the nonsense of Brexit. In fact, the first time I became aware of him was when he wrote to every vice-chancellor in the country demanding the names and I think course descriptions of every academic institution in the land that was teaching positively about the European Union or negatively about the idiocy of leaving. And that, of course, became the Daily Mail front page. Our Remainer universities, as dozens of Tories are investigated for allegedly taking a punt using inside knowledge on the date of the general election. The Daily Mail goes with the headline, 10 days left to stop disaster of a Starmer supermajority. So it was Chris Heaton-Harris who was responsible for the Our Remainer universities front page, which alongside Enemies of the People and Crush the Saboteurs marked a sort of hat trick of profoundly fascistic rhetoric being emblazoned on the front cover of the best-selling newspaper in the country. So the mystery of how we've ended up in such an almighty mess, of course, and crucially how the Tory party has ended up facing existential threat while a politician who may or may not have been described as an ally of the Kremlin this weekend somehow manages to sweep up some of the detritus they leave behind isn't really a mystery at all. All of the facts are out there in plain sight. It's just a question of whether you can be bothered to find them or look for them. But the scale of the story is what intrigues me this morning. The scale of the story. And before I play you this clip of Chris Eaton-Harris talking to Nick this morning, I would remind you that if you're a footballer, you'll correct me if I'm wrong on this, but if you're a footballer, you're not allowed to bet on any games, whether you're in them or not. I mean, it's one of the rules of being a footballer. If you're a sportsman, you're not allowed to bet on the sports in which you are involved. It doesn't matter what the law is. It's the rules. I mean, it is, I think, regulated, but it's a form of moral code. So the best defence this character has got, as Declan says, the worst Secretary of State for Northern Ireland we've ever had. And remember, Theresa Villiers had the job before him. The more you sort of look at this, or the more you listen to this, the more you realise what a madness we're currently engulfed in.
The Prime Minister's anger was apparent when, of course, this story broke last week, and he said that anyone who was found to be guilty would be thrown out of the party pretty speedily. One candidate, Craig Williams, has admitted he did it and he's made a mistake. Why is he still standing?
Yeah, well, I mean, there's both a principal point and a practical point there. Firstly, he said, I believe the quote was a few weeks before, that needs to be determined as to whether he actually had prior knowledge, because the whole point of this is whether you had knowledge of the data or not, which is what the Gambling Commission are investigating.
But he's admitted he made a mistake and he's apologised for it, which surely indicates...
Yeah.
So why is he still in the party?
Not quite until the Gambling Commission say, exactly this. The answer is not quite, and they are independent of us.
So even though the man himself admits it, the Conservatives still have to wait for the Gambling Commission to underscore what the man himself says. Is that right?
No. So he said he made a bet, and that was a mistake. We don't know, and I don't believe anybody does know. Maybe the Gambling Commission do, but. And they have said they're not naming people and they're not going to comment on ongoing investigations themselves. But we don't know whether he did that with prior knowledge or whether that was just a hunch or whatever. And so until that comes to be true, or be found out, we don't know.
I'm tempted to ask Eleanor to cut that up and just remove all Nick's comments and just listen to a man go... Chris Eaton-Harris isn't even standing at the general election. So as part of the general election campaign, the Tories are now putting out a man who is not standing in the general election to defend identified and currently unidentified candidates and colleagues who stand accused of placing bets on the date of the general election using information gleaned from their positions of privilege. Now, a member of Rishi Sunak's close protection squad accused of the same offence has been arrested. He's been arrested. And yet the bloke who has admitted that he made a mistake is still running. I hate it when this happens, because the question I really want to ask you is actually one of the questions I say that no decent radio presenter ever asks. No decent radio phone-in host ever asks. Don't worry, it's not about parking tickets. The question I really want to ask you is, how big a deal do you think this is? And rules are, of course, made to be broken, and you don't have to be zany to work here, but it helps. The reason I want to ask you that question is because sometimes I need to recalibrate my political compass. So sometimes I sit here thinking, this is bloody huge. This is absolutely enormous. I can say with absolute confidence it's much bigger than Keir Starmer's curry or Angela Rayner's decade-and-a-half-old housing arrangements. And it's not being completely ignored by the right-wing media, but it's certainly not being turned into the sort of circus that it would be. Could you imagine for a moment what the Daily Mail or the Daily Telegraph would be doing today if it was Labour people accused of filling their boots? And the reason why I want you to tell me how big you think this story is and should be, is and or should be. Remember, a policeman's been arrested as a consequence of exactly the same allegations that Conservative candidates, directors of campaign and dozens of other associates, friends and families of Tories and Tory officials. The policeman's actually been arrested. And I just have a sense that this is a sign of how far down the rabbit hole we've all gone. Should this be the only story in town? 0345 6060 973. How big a deal do you think it is? And the reason why I want to talk about it, well, I think that's pretty clear why I want to talk about it. But the sophisticated treatment, if you like, of this question, because the reason I don't like that is it a very big deal question is because it doesn't involve a great deal of thinking on my part. But let me explain the thinking behind the simplicity on this occasion. Carol Vorderman, whose third act has become one of the most enjoyable experiences of the sort of politics showbiz crossover in recent years, and who now, of course, is a shining jewel in the crown of LBC's weekend schedule. But Carol Vorderman and I were talking some time ago on my Full Disclosure podcast about the PPE contracts. And what we both struggled with, and I think Carol would concede, it does open us up to accusations of naivety or even silliness, but we both struggled with the idea that when national catastrophe appears on the horizon, we would respond by asking, what can we do to help? Or you know, by keeping our heads down and letting the experts get on with it. As broadcasters, I'd like to think that we kept you company or held the government to account or spoke truth to power. But outside of this weird profession, if you were in business, for example, if you were an entrepreneur, national catastrophe appears on the horizon, and a significant swathe of Tory donors and Tory supporters immediately ask themselves the question, what's in it for me? And it was quite reassuring, actually, to have that conversation with Carol, because it can be a little bit lonely sometimes in this business, holding the positions that I hold. And talking to Carol crystallised the idea that there's something, and I use this word advisedly, there's something truly sick about looking at the prospect of national catastrophe on the horizon and asking how you can make a few quid out of it. Now, listen, I'm not as comfortable with the supremely rich as perhaps Peter Mandelson professed himself to be a few years ago, but I certainly don't want a communist redistribution of wealth. And even if a communist redistribution of wealth was undertaken, by lunchtime that day, we'd have people with nothing and people with plenty. That's the nature of humanity. It's the nature of human interactions. And I am perfectly happy for you to conclude that I'm some sort of undergraduate snowflake, but I am disgusted to my core by the memory and the emerging details, despite Rishi Sunak's best efforts not to investigate properly, the emerging details of people often very adjacent to or contributors for the Conservative Party, looking at the COVID catastrophe on the horizon and saying to themselves, and presumably to each other, up to and including husbands and wives, looking at an imminent national disaster and thinking first, how can I make a few quid out of this? Some of the stories, Private Eye have done amazing work on this. Some of the stories of people buying mansions with the profits from companies that before the pandemic had no profits or didn't exist, making so much money so quickly by getting onto that VIP PPE lane that I kind of find myself thinking that this is like a pound shop version of exactly the same thing. Some Tories found out or knew or heard reliable rumours about when the election was going to be, and their first thought was, how can I make a few quid out of this? Now, the numbers are negligible compared to what was made out of PPE, but I put it to you this morning in an outbreak of characteristic pomposity. I put it to you, my lud. I put it to you that this could be exactly the same thing. The only difference is the number of zeros on the end of the payout that they were poised and hoping to receive. And to that end, I don't really care about the law on this occasion. I don't care whether somebody who got a PPE contract with a 200% markup on a mask was breaking the law or not. They were breaking something that we used to hold dear in this country before Brexit and Boris Johnson and Liz Truss and Nigel Farage became prominent fixtures in our public discourse. We used to care about. Did we care about codes of honour? Did we care about standards? Did we care about morality? Or did we just not notice the people who see a national catastrophe on the horizon or a general election coming up in the outside lane and think to themselves first and foremost and fastest, how can I make a few quid out of this? How can I make a few quid out of this? Do you know what? I'm going to tell old Johnny as well. Johnny, over here, mate. I got a little bit of an insider tip for you. A little bit. You want to get yourself on this PPE bandwagon, mate? It's going to be trebles all round by tea time. Not quite the same stakes, old boy, but you might want to have a little bit of a flutter on the general election. Cost of living crisis? Poof. Here's a chance to make a few hundred nicker. I don't know, but that's what I want you to tell me.